Good afternoon. Today I'll be talking about repetitive strain injury in the Canadian workplace and the causes, the treatments, and how the disease comes about. So recently I did a business report on it, and it was very intriguing to see what statistics are out there for this. And yeah, it was very surprising actually. The Canadian Statistics Bureau there said that 1 in 10 working Canadians suffer from a repetitive strain injury, and for 1 in 10 people to feel the amount of pain that a repetitive strain has, it's incredible. So today, I'll be talking about the repetitive strains and all the effects. So the RSIs are increasing, even though that there are more treatments and more causes for prevention. RSIs in Canadian workplaces are still increasing. And that is mainly because the retirement age for Canadians, as well as people all over the world, has been as high as it ever has been. And for people who are doing laboring jobs, working in warehouses, which is where we do see a majority of these RSIs, people really need to start taking back on their work, but it is hard for that to happen when they still need to provide an income for their family when they are from the ages 50 to 65. It is still incredibly hard for those families as well, especially the middle class to lower class. So now we're going to move on to the causes. So a lot of the causes for RSIs are caused by the repetitive movements, which strain a certain group of muscles. So an example of this would be tennis elbow. If you're always extending or flexing your elbow, your arm, so your elbow there becomes under tension a lot. So you see that a lot with laboring jobs such as like hammering, and like bricklayers. A lot of those people have strained backs as well. So that comes with improper lifting technique, and that is maybe in my opinion the highest cause of RSIs is improper lifting technique. Because in a warehouse, if you're lifting up boxes all the time, you're using the wrong group of muscles that are associated with that lift, and therefore you're putting strain on the wrong places, such as your back, your shoulders, and your hips. Okay, so it is very important that you use the proper technique, which is using bending your knees, lifting with your butt because it's the biggest muscle, and keeping your back straight and shoulders retracted. Okay, it's very important. Another cause is, I believe, is posture. So when you're sitting down at a desk all day, you tend to hover over your desk a bit, and that means that your shoulders are being rolled forward, and all of your muscles that are activating there are not used to that movement, and normally should be retracted, keeping your back straight and your shoulders back as well. So all of these muscles here that are always underused are now being used for 10 hours a day. And that puts a continuous strain on your body, and that affects down the chain as well. So you're not just feeling it in your shoulders, but then it leads to your back and also your torso. We're going to move on to treatments now. So as I said, that treatments have never been higher and more available to clients and people in the workforce. Once you do get an RSI, it's very important that you go to your boss and then you work out a treatment plan so that you're able to fix it and return to work as soon as possible, okay? And that goes through the Workplace Health and Safety Committee of Canada, and through that you're able to go through a bunch of the treatments and see which is best for you through a doctor or someone or a physio who's legally able to do that. So if it's a very minor RSI, like you're just starting to feel that, a doctor will normally tell you the RICE treatment there. So that is rest, ice, compression, and elevate. So what you need to do there is yeah, just keep the body part there in that RICE formula there. So rest, ice, compress, and elevate. Um, like athletes use that a lot as well. You know, when they get a soft tissue injury, it really helps the swelling to go down and the blood circulation to increase as well. So that normally helps there. If the RSI is a bit more severe than that, then you need to get either medication or rehabilitation. So the medication should be painkillers or reduce swelling or something along those lines, and that should really help with the recovery of an RSI. Physiotherapy as well for a long-term injury. You know, it's going to be every day. You're doing exercises, trying to recover from what you're doing. And lastly, surgery is the last extent there. So, um, you know, you're not going to do surgery unless you really have to, because that's going to put you out for work for months. You know, and a lot of people can't really afford that. So, it's best to sum up your treatments and then choose one that's the best option for you as well. Lastly, we're going to talk about prevention here. So prevention, talked about proper lifting technique before. So it's very important that you need to do to use the appropriate lifting technique. Sorry. Another way to prevent RSIs is stretching, keeping fit and healthy, daily exercise of 30 minutes a day, and eating the right food sources as well, because everything adds up to your body. And I always say that if people were servicing their cars, once every 2 months, but yet, they're not looking after their bodies, that's really saying something about the community there. Um, so thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you learned a lot about repetitive strain injuries in the Canadian workplace. Thank you.